By 1943, the skies over Europe were filled with the steady drone of American bombers, massive B-17s and B-24s, cutting through icy winds at altitudes higher than the peaks of the Alps. Their crews were young, many barely out of high school, carrying the heavy responsibility of striking deep into enemy territory. They believed in the promise of precision bombing, that science, discipline, and courage could make warfare cleaner, faster, more targeted. But that belief was being tested with every mission. High above the clouds, nothing behaved as the manuals predicted. Crosswinds twisted flight paths, updrafts and turbulence sent bombs drifting in strange arcs. Even with the most advanced bomb sight of its time, the Norden, a mechanical computer that could supposedly place a bomb within a few dozen feet of its target, accuracy was an illusion. When the films from reconnaissance planes came back, the truth was undeniable. Factories, refineries, and rail yards had been missed by hundreds of meters. Bombs scattered across open fields or destroyed residential blocks instead of strategic targets. Crews risked everything for results that looked like chaos from above. Some blamed nerves, others blamed the weather, but a few minds began to suspect something deeper. Maybe the problem wasn't the bomb sight, the crews, or even the wind. Maybe it was the very way the planes were flying. Each mission revealed the same frustrating pattern. When bombers flew directly at the target and released on a straight course, the bombs tended to drift with the wind, carried sideways as they fell. No amount of precision aiming seemed to fix it. The concept of flying straight, the sacred rule of bombing accuracy, was betraying them. In briefings and barracks, airmen started asking questions that sounded almost heretical. What if the plane didn't need to face the target at all? What if instead of fighting the wind, they worked with it? That idea, born from frustration and desperation, would soon evolve into one of the most unexpected innovations of the entire air war. Before long, American bombers would begin doing something no one had been trained to do: fly sideways into the wind and drop their bombs off angle. It looked strange, it sounded wrong, but it would change everything. In the months that followed, engineers and analysts began poring over reconnaissance photos, mission reports, and bomb impact maps. The results painted a pattern too consistent to ignore. Bombs were not just missing randomly. They were drifting in the same direction, over and over again, depending on the wind. At first, commanders dismissed the findings. It was easy to blame human error, bad luck, or poor visibility. But the numbers were too precise to be coincidence. What scientists discovered was simple, yet revolutionary. The wind didn't just push the plane, it pushed the bombs too. When a bomber flew straight toward a target with a crosswind, the aircraft could correct its path with the rudder. But once the bombs were released, they no longer shared the plane's control. They were carried sideways by the invisible river of air, moving across the sky. Even a small breeze could shift a falling bomb hundreds of meters off course. This realization changed everything. The more the analysts studied, the clearer it became that conventional bombing runs, long, straight approaches with no angular correction, were mathematically flawed. The physics of the air simply didn't allow for perfect alignment. At Eglin Field in Florida, a handful of test pilots and engineers began running controlled experiments. They simulated high-altitude crosswinds, using smoke trails and sand markers, trying to understand how the bombs behaved once released. What they saw on the ground matched the data from Europe. Every straight-line drop produced a predictable sideways drift. That was when someone proposed an idea that went against decades of flight doctrine. Instead of flying into the target, what if the bomber flew into the wind? By angling the aircraft slightly sideways, or crabbing into the crosswind, the pilot could compensate for the drift before the release. It would mean approaching the target at an angle, the nose of the plane pointing away from the actual line of attack. To the traditionalists, it sounded absurd, bombing sideways. How could that possibly improve accuracy? Yet the math supported it. By adjusting the plane's course so the wind's push balanced the aircraft's drift, the bombs would fall straight down onto the target. Even though the plane itself wasn't flying directly toward it, it was a strange counterintuitive concept. Fly crooked to drop straight. But in the quiet hangars and dusty test fields of Florida, it started to look like the breakthrough that could finally make precision bombing real. While most of the Air Force focused on surviving each mission, a smaller group of minds began working on the problem that no one else had time to solve. At Eglin Field in Florida, far from the front lines, a mix of engineers, test pilots, and bombardiers quietly formed an experimental unit. Their task wasn't glamorous, no combat medals, no parades, but what they were about to uncover would transform the way American bombers fought the war. Among them were men who had flown the missions and seen firsthand how unpredictable the air could be. They weren't just engineers working with equations, they were pilots who had watched their bombs drift off target while under fire. That combination of experience and technical curiosity proved powerful. They started small, using old B-25s and B-17s for test flights. They painted long white lines on the ground to mark imaginary targets, then released sand-filled practice bombs to record impact points. Each drop added another clue. The results were consistent. When the bomber flew directly toward the target, even a moderate crosswind sent the bombs well off to the side. But when they adjusted their course, turning slightly into the wind, the impacts began clustering much closer to center. That was the moment when the theory became reality. They were seeing, with their own eyes, that a sideways approach corrected what no sighting system could. The air itself had always been the missing variable, and now, by working with it instead of against it, they could control where the bombs would land. At first, the method was rough. Pilots had to judge angles by instinct. There were no manuals, no instruments for sideways bombing. They tested over and over again, learning how the aircraft behaved when crabbing into the wind, how much to correct, how to time the release. The slightest delay, even a fraction of a second, could throw the bombs off course again. Their findings soon began spreading quietly through the ranks of tacticians and trainers. It wasn't yet official doctrine, but it was too effective to ignore. Reports from test missions showed accuracy improving dramatically. For the first time, bombing wasn't just about courage and luck. It was about understanding the invisible forces that shaped every drop. Still, convincing commanders would not be easy. The Air Force had built its strategy around flying straight and level. Angling into a target looked strange, even reckless. It went against every instinct a pilot had been taught. But the innovators at Eglin Field didn't care about tradition. They cared about results. And as the war intensified, their sideways approach would soon move from test fields to the front lines, where lives and the outcome of entire campaigns depended on getting it right. The first time the idea of bombing sideways reached the higher command, it was met with silence, the kind of silence that meant disbelief. For generations, pilots had been taught that precision came from stability. Fly straight, fly level, trust your bomb sight. The notion of approaching a target at an angle, nose pointed away from the objective, sounded like a mistake waiting to happen. Air Force leadership had invested millions in technology like the Norden bomb sight, proudly advertised as a device so precise it could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel. To them, the problem wasn't the method, it was the method. They believed more training, more discipline, or clearer weather would solve the issue. The thought that their entire doctrine might be flawed was unthinkable. But the engineers at Eglin Field had proof. They had films, data sheets, and impact maps, showing how their angled crosswind runs consistently hit closer to target. When they demonstrated the results in person, showing how the wind correction worked in practice, some officers began to take notice. The logic was undeniable. The air was always moving, so to hit the target, the plane needed to move with it. Still, others resisted. Many pilots were uneasy about changing a system that, despite its flaws, was familiar. "You're telling me to aim left to hit straight?" one bombardier scoffed. "That sounds like a great way to miss twice." The sideways technique required teamwork, trust, and perfect timing between pilot and bombardier. Any hesitation, and the bombs would fall far from their mark. To make the case stronger, test squadrons began flying demonstration missions for skeptical commanders. They showed two approaches, one using the traditional straight-line method and another using the new angled technique. The difference was striking. On the first run, bombs fell scattered and wide. On the second, using the sideways approach, the impacts clustered tightly around the target zone. The evidence spoke louder than any argument. Bit by bit, attitudes began to shift. What started as a fringe experiment became a topic in strategy meetings. Commanders who had once dismissed the idea began quietly recommending it to trusted crews. Reports from those who tried it came back the same: fewer wasted bombs, fewer repeat missions, better results, and sometimes fewer losses. The shift wasn't sudden or easy. It took months of persuasion, testing, and field experience to break through decades of rigid thinking. But in war, results mattered more than pride. The sideways method was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming a tactical edge. By the end of 1943, whispers of this strange new way to bomb began circulating across bomber groups in England and Italy. Crews gave it their own nicknames: crab runs, wind slides, the drift fix. Whatever they called it, one truth was becoming clear: flying sideways might look wrong, but it worked, and soon it would be put to the ultimate test. Not in the calm skies of Florida, but in the flak-filled air over occupied Europe. By early 1944, the experiment had left the safety of the test range. The sideways bombing technique, once a quiet curiosity of engineers and instructors at Eglin Field, was now being introduced to real combat crews, flying out of England and Italy. Many of these men had never heard of it before. They were told only that it could improve accuracy and cut down mission time. Most were skeptical. In war, unproven ideas could get people killed. The first missions using the technique were small-scale, assigned to experienced crews who could be trusted to adapt under pressure. The weather over northern France that winter was brutal: fast crosswinds, low clouds, unpredictable air current, perfect conditions to test whether the new method actually worked outside the lab. From the ground, a sideways bombing run looked strange. The massive B-17s and B-24s approached the target, not head-on, but at a visible angle, their noses tilted into the wind. To the enemy's gunners below, it looked like a formation out of alignment. But to those inside the bombers, everything was precise. The pilots crabbed into the crosswind, keeping the target steady in the bombardier's sight. The Norden bomb sight, calibrated for straight runs, had been manually adjusted to account for the new approach. Inside the cramped bombardier's compartment, the airmen watched the target drift slowly into the crosshairs, not from the center of the glass, but from one end. The pilot held steady, fighting turbulence, adjusting just enough to keep the drift perfectly balanced. The bombs were released. Seconds later, the formation climbed away, engines straining as the crews craned their necks to look back. The explosions bloomed exactly where they were meant to, on the target, not miles away. Reconnaissance photos later confirmed it. The impacts were tight, consistent, and dramatically closer than any previous mission under similar conditions. Word spread quickly. The crews began calling it the sideways drop. Some said it felt unnatural at first, like flying crooked on purpose, but the results were undeniable. When executed properly, the crosswind approach nearly tripled the number of bombs landing within the target zone. It meant fewer missions were needed to achieve the same effect, saving time, fuel, and most importantly, lives. As more bomber groups adopted the technique, data flowed back to headquarters. Hit rates improved across multiple theaters, bridges, factories, and depots. that once required repeated attacks were being destroyed in a single strike. Analysts noticed a sharp drop in the number of bombs wasted on open ground. The method that had once seemed counterintuitive was now reshaping how commanders planned their raids, but the new precision came with a cost. Flying sideways into a target demanded exact coordination. If the pilot misjudged the wind or the bombardier released even a second too late, the entire pattern could fail. Crews spent hours in training flights, learning to read wind drift and correct by instinct. They learned to trust their instruments and each other completely. The sideways technique also changed the feel of combat itself. Pilots no longer focused solely on keeping the plane straight through flak. Now they had to maintain delicate balance while flying slightly off angle. It required nerves of steel. Every motion had to be controlled, every correction subtle, every decision timed to the second. Despite the risks, the advantages were impossible to ignore. Commanders began incorporating sideways bombing into mission briefings as standard practice when crosswinds were strong. Crews that once doubted the idea became its biggest supporters. Some even claimed the angled approach made them harder targets for enemy guns, since the formation's profile shifted unpredictably as it approached. By mid-1944, the sideways drop was no longer a curiosity. It was a quiet revolution. It turned physics into strategy and gave Allied bombers a new level of accuracy that had seemed impossible only a year earlier. For the first time, air power began to match its promise of precision. Every mission still carried danger, but now, when the bomb bay doors opened and the earth appeared below, the crews knew they had more than courage on their side. They had understanding, the kind that came from studying the invisible forces of the sky and learning how to use them. And as the Allied advance pushed closer to victory, the strange sideways way of flying would prove to be one of the most important and least known breakthroughs of the entire air war. By the spring of 1944, the sideways bombing method was no longer confined to test flights or small experimental missions. It was being used in real combat over occupied France, the Low Countries, and deep into Germany. The stakes were higher than ever. Every mission now carried the weight of strategy itself. Rail yards, oil depots, and factories were chosen not just for their importance, but for how well the new technique could strike them. The 8th Air Force was the first to deploy it widely. Pilots received quiet briefings before takeoff. Adjust for crosswind, hold the crab, trust your sight. It wasn't official doctrine, at least not yet, but the crews who had tried it swore by it. When the winds were strong, the results spoke for themselves. Those first full-scale operations weren't smooth. Flying into a target sideways while maintaining formation demanded extraordinary coordination. Each pilot had to match the angle of the others precisely. Too much crab angle, and the formation spread apart. Too little, and the entire group drifted off course. Communication was limited to hand signals and intercom bursts over the roar of engines and the crackle of radio static. Over targets like Hamburg and Cologne, flak filled the air like a storm of black smoke. The bombers came in angled against the wind, maintaining their line with painstaking precision. Bombardiers watched the target slide across their sights, counting down the seconds, calling out steady, drop. And when the bombs fell, something extraordinary began to happen. Reconnaissance photos taken the next day showed concentrated strikes, damage clustered tightly around industrial centers, bridges severed cleanly, rail hubs shattered. The difference was so clear that intelligence officers initially questioned the reports, suspecting photographic error. But mission after mission, the pattern repeated. The sideways bombers were hitting closer, faster, and more efficiently than any straight-line group. Their losses were even slightly lower, partly because the angled runs made them less predictable to enemy gunners. The Luftwaffe's flak batteries, trained to anticipate the classic head-on approach, struggled to adjust to aircraft that appeared to drift across the sky. In June 1944, During the run-up to the Normandy landings, the technique played a crucial role. With unpredictable coastal winds and narrow target windows, traditional bombing would have been unreliable. But with the crosswind correction method, bomber crews struck transport hubs, artillery positions, and railway choke points with remarkable accuracy. Those hits disrupted reinforcements and supply lines, helping pave the way for the invasion. Crews began to take pride in mastering what had once seemed an impossible maneuver. Pilots described the satisfaction of watching their bombs land precisely where intended. After so many missions of frustration and loss, it wasn't just skill, it was proof that learning from failure could change the course of the war. Engineers and tacticians back home collected mission data obsessively. They compared wind speeds, angles, bomb weights, and each successful mission refined the calculations and confirmed what the England field team had always believed, that the key to accuracy wasn't in fighting nature, but in understanding it. By late 1944, the sideways method had spread through nearly every major bomber group in the European theater. Some called it crosswind bombing, others angled approach, but the crews had their own simple term for it: flying smart. What began as a desperate experiment had become a symbol of adaptation, proof that even in the middle of chaos, innovation could rise from necessity. The air war was changing, and for the first time it was doing so on science's terms. Each mission that ended with a target hit instead of a field missed, each plane that returned with its crew alive, reinforced a simple truth: sometimes victory doesn't come from flying faster or higher, but from learning to fly differently. By late 1944, the results were impossible to ignore. The sideways bombing technique, what crews now called the crosswind run, had gone from an experimental curiosity to a defining element of Allied air strategy. The data was overwhelming. Bombing accuracy had more than doubled in most operations, and in some cases tripled. Targets that once required entire squadrons and multiple sorties could now be neutralized in a single mission. For the first time, precision was not just a slogan, it was real. The change began to alter the entire logic of the air war. Before, the bomber strategy had been built around sheer numbers: send enough planes, drop enough bombs, and eventually something would hit. It was a brutal arithmetic of probability and loss. But now, with the angled approach correcting for wind drift, accuracy no longer depended solely on volume. A smaller force, properly aligned and coordinated, could deliver the same impact with far less risk. At Allied Air Command, analysts pored over mission reports with growing amazement. Reconnaissance photos from Germany told a new story: key bridges, fuel depots, and armament plants hit dead center. Entire rail networks had been severed, cutting off critical supply routes. In the span of a few months, the effectiveness of bombing campaigns had transformed. This shift had deep consequences. Every successful strike meant fewer repeat missions, fewer aircraft lost, and fewer airmen who wouldn't return. For the crews, that mattered more than any statistic. Pilots and bombardiers who had once felt powerless against unpredictable winds now had a tool that worked, and the confidence that came with it. It also changed how missions were planned. Tacticians began designing operations around meteorological forecasts, analyzing wind patterns in detail to determine optimal approach angles. Weather, once an enemy, became part of the strategy. Commanders even started timing raids to coincide with favorable air currents, using the very forces that once sabotaged them to their advantage. This new level of precision reshaped the ground war as well. When transportation networks in Western Europe were systematically destroyed in early 1945, enemy units found themselves unable to move fuel, ammunition, or reinforcements efficiently. The war machine was choking from within. The improved accuracy of the bombers meant every strike carried strategic weight, amplifying the pressure on all fronts. But perhaps the most profound impact wasn't measured in destroyed targets. It was psychological. The airmen who had once dreaded long, uncertain missions now felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were no longer flying blind into the wind. They understood it, anticipated it, mastered it. For the first time, their courage was matched by control. In briefings across England and Italy, the message was repeated again and again. Don't fight the wind, use it. It became more than a tactic, it was a mindset. A small shift in thinking had changed the dynamics of an entire campaign. By the winter of 1945, with Allied forces pushing steadily toward victory, the sideways bombing technique had become standard procedure, no longer questioned, no longer experimental. It was simply how things were done. The air war had evolved, and in doing so it revealed a larger truth that extended far beyond the battlefield. Progress rarely comes from doing the same thing better. It comes from daring to do something different. The bombers that once flew straight into failure were now flying at an angle and winning. Behind every innovation, behind every calculated angle and precise release, there were human beings, young, tired, and afraid, yet determined to do their job. The sideways bombing method may have looked like a technical breakthrough on paper, but in the cockpit, it was a matter of instinct, teamwork, and trust. For the crews, flying sideways into a storm of flak and tracer fire wasn't just another maneuver. It was a psychological test. The pilot had to fight his own instincts. Everything in his training told him to point the aircraft straight toward the target. Now, he had to hold it at an angle, flying as if slipping across the sky, feeling the wind press unevenly against the wings. The bombardier, crouched in the glass nose of the aircraft, stared through the sight, calling out corrections in calm, measured tones while the world erupted around him. One veteran later described it simply: "The first time we tried it, it felt wrong. The horizon was tilted. The target wasn't where it should have been, but then the photos came back and we were dead on. After that, we trusted it. Every man in the formation depended on the others. If even one aircraft broke alignment, the entire run could unravel." Pilots had to read each other's movements by instinct, adjusting their positions in a kind of silent choreography amid chaos. Bombardiers learned to compensate for tiny misjudgments in altitude or wind speed. Gunners kept their eyes on the sky, ready for fighters or flak bursts. Everyone had a part, and everyone's part mattered. The training for the sideways approach was grueling. Crews spent hours learning how to calculate drift, how to sense when the wind was shifting, how to anticipate the moment of release without relying entirely on instruments. They rehearsed over and over, flying practice runs above the English countryside, watching smoke markers fall closer and closer to their targets. What had once felt awkward became natural, a rhythm of coordination and control. But even with mastery came fear. The sideways approach sometimes forced bombers to stay exposed longer over the target area. Holding that angle meant delaying evasive maneuvers for precious seconds. Crews knew those seconds could mean life or death. They talked about it quietly, in mess halls or while checking their gear before missions. Yet, no one argued with the results. Accuracy meant fewer follow-up missions. Fewer missions meant fewer empty bunks. When they returned, letters home often hid the reality of those flights. Pilots wrote about routine missions and better luck with the drops. They rarely mentioned the trembling hands, the shaking engines, or the smell of cold oil and cordite in the cabin. But in private journals and post-war interviews, the truth came out. They were proud, not just because they survived, but because they learned to make survival mean something. The sideways bombing technique gave them something intangible, a sense of control in a war that had taken so much of it away. They weren't just surviving chaos, they were mastering it. And when the missions ended, and the photographs came back, showing direct hits, where once there had been empty fields, they felt something they hadn't felt before. Confidence, not in luck, not in machinery, but in their own skill. For those who lived through it, the memory never faded. The sight of the target sliding diagonally through the bomb site, the wind pressing hard against the fuselage, the moment of release, when everything hung in stillness before the earth erupted below. It became the image of precision itself. They had turned the invisible forces of the sky into allies, and in doing so, they found a kind of peace within the storm. By the beginning of 1945, the cumulative effect of the sideways bombing revolution had become unmistakable. What started as a quiet experiment among a handful of engineers and test pilots had grown into a tactical transformation, one that was now reshaping the entire air war over Europe. The skies that had once seemed uncontrollable were now for the first time predictable, measurable, tameable. Every mission that used the angled approach delivered proof of its power. Supply depots, bridges, and refineries that had withstood months of bombardment were finally being struck with surgical accuracy. The German transport network, once the nervous system of the war machine, was breaking apart. Trains stalled on destroyed tracks, fuel convoys stranded miles from the front, factories left without parts or electricity. The air offensive had evolved from brute force to precision engineering. Allied planners quickly realized the strategic potential. They began selecting targets not just for their size or visibility, but for their vulnerability to precise hits. A single bridge destroyed in the right place could halt an entire division. A refinery taken offline could cripple tank production for weeks. Bombing runs became less about overwhelming destruction and more about intelligent disruption. The sideways technique turned the bombers into instruments of precision. Rather than chaos, crews who once dropped their loads in frustration now struck with confidence. Their missions no longer required multiple passes over the same area, a dangerous practice that had cost many lives. With the new method, one run was often enough. Each successful strike meant fewer planes in the air, less exposure to enemy defenses, and a faster path toward victory. The results rippled through the front lines. Infantry units advancing across France and Belgium found enemy resistance weaker, less organized, more desperate. Commanders in the field noticed that critical bridges and fuel depots, targets once thought untouchable, were suddenly gone. Even without knowing the details, soldiers on the ground could feel that something in the air war had changed. The angled bombing approach also influenced strategy beyond Europe. Allied air forces in the Pacific adopted similar wind correction techniques to counter the unpredictable jet streams over Japan. The lessons learned from the European skies about drift, trajectory, and aerodynamic precision proved universal. The same physics that had guided bombs over Cologne now guided them over Tokyo. But perhaps the greatest impact was psychological. The sideways bombing method gave the airmen and the command something they had long lacked: faith in precision. For years, the promise of the strategic bomber had been overshadowed by inefficiency and loss. Now that promise was being fulfilled. Air power was no longer just about destruction, it was about control. Historians would later note that this shift, though subtle at first, was one of the turning points of the war. It allowed the Allies to cripple the enemy's infrastructure faster than it could be repaired, while conserving the resources and manpower needed for the final push into Germany. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces closed in from all directions, the bombers continued their angled runs. Steady, calculated, confident. The skies no longer belonged to chance or the wind. They belonged to those who had learned to understand both. In the end, the sideways bombing method wasn't just a new way to drop bombs. It was a new way to think. It proved that progress didn't always come from building something bigger or faster, but from seeing the problem differently. And as the war drew to its close, the lesson of those tilted bombers remained clear. Victory often belongs to those who dare to fly against convention. When the war finally ended, the world turned its eyes toward peace. But in the quiet hangars and briefing rooms, the lessons of the sideways bombing method were just beginning to take root. What had started as a desperate field innovation, an attempt to outthink the wind, became a cornerstone of post-war aviation science. The principle was simple, yet profound. Precision was not only about the weapon, It was about understanding the environment around it. In the months following victory, teams of engineers and strategists began compiling the mountains of mission data collected during the war. They studied photographs, flight logs, and bomb impact charts. Again and again, the same conclusion appeared. Success had come not from new machinery, but from adaptation, from a willingness to question what everyone thought they already knew. The concept of flying sideways into the wind evolved into a standard known as wind correction angle, a calculation still used today by pilots of every kind, from fighter jets to commercial airliners. Every time an aircraft adjusts its heading to compensate for crosswinds on approach, it's applying the same principle that those wartime crews discovered under fire. But the legacy didn't end in the cockpit. The sideways bombing technique laid the intellectual groundwork for a new era of precision warfare. As technology advanced, guided bombs and targeting computers inherited the same philosophy. Accuracy begins with understanding motion, drift, and timing. The same physics that once guided heavy bombs through the wind now guided missiles and drones with pinpoint precision. In military academies and flight schools, the crosswind correction case study became a classic lesson in innovation, an example of how a small, counterintuitive change can alter the outcome of a massive conflict. Tenders taught it as proof that even in war, progress depends on open minds and scientific thinking. Yet for the men who had flown those missions, the legacy was far more personal. Many of them returned home with little fanfare, their contributions overshadowed by larger headlines and more visible victories. But among themselves, they knew. They had seen what it meant to turn failure into understanding, to face chaos and find order inside it. Some went on to become test pilots, engineers, or instructors, bringing the lessons of Eglin Field and the European skies into the jet age. Others simply carried the memory, the sight of a target sliding diagonally through the bomb site, the subtle pressure of the wind against the wing, the strange satisfaction of watching a perfect hit bloom where it was meant to. The story of the sideways bombing revolution is more than a tale of technology. It's a reminder of human adaptability. It shows how innovation often emerges, not from invention, but from observation, not from power, but from precision. It's the story of people who learned that victory could come, not from flying harder, but from flying smarter. Today, decades later, every pilot who corrects for crosswind, every precision strike guided by invisible calculations, and every engineer who questions the way things have always been done, continues that same legacy. The men who once tilted their wings against the wind changed more than the course of a war. They changed the way humanity understands the sky.